It started in a neighborhood where 4 streets met and 5 corners formed a slum that most New Yorkers avoided after dark. The 5 Points was crowded, violent, and politically valuable. Out of that chaos rose a man named Francesco Paolo Antonio Vaccarelli, better known as Paul Kelly. He did not simply lead a gang, he reorganized the underworld. This is the story of the 5 Points gang, the street wars with Monk Eastman, the election fraud that bought protection, and the young recruits who would later become Al Capone and Lucky Luciano. Before the Mafia families ran America's rackets, there was the 5 Points. In the early 19th century, long before Paul Kelly ever stepped onto the streets of Manhattan, there was a patch of land in Lower Manhattan that carried a reputation heavy enough to shape the city's criminal future. It was known as the 5 Points. The name came from geography. 4 streets converged in a crooked intersection: Anthony Street, now Worth Street, Cross Street, now Moscow Street, Orange Street, now Baxter Street, and Little Water Street, which no longer exists. Their meeting formed 5 corners, an irregular crossroads that became one of the most notorious neighborhoods in American history. Just a block away ran Mulberry Street, lined with crowded tenements and sagging wooden structures. By the 1820s, the area had become a center of settlement for poor immigrants. The buildings were old even then, remnants from the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Warehouses stood beside crumbling brick dwellings. Wood frame houses leaned into each other as if they needed the support. The first major waves of residents were poor English and Scots-Irish families. By the 1840s, the district absorbed increasing numbers of German, Welsh, and especially Irish refugees, many fleeing famine and political unrest. The neighborhood was packed, unsanitary, and economically desperate. Crime did not arrive overnight. It grew in the cracks of poverty. Gambling dens and brothels became common fixtures. The streets were dangerous after dark. Muggings were frequent. Visitors who wandered in without understanding the terrain often did not leave with their wallets. In 1842, British author Charles Dickens toured the 5 Points. He was appalled by what he saw, describing overcrowding and substandard housing that shocked even someone familiar with London's worst districts. The deeper tension, though, ran beyond crime. In the years before the American Civil War, Catholic immigrants, particularly the Irish, faced open hostility from nativist white Anglo-Saxon Protestant groups. They were mocked for their faith, boxed out of jobs, and treated as a permanent underclass. Street gangs began as a response to that pressure. Groups like the Kerryonians, the 40 Thieves, the Shirt Tails, and the Chichesters formed in the 5 Points as ethnic street organizations. At first, they were loose bands of young men defending blocks, saloons, and neighborhood identity. Over time, defense blurred into aggression. Protection turned into extortion. Rivalry turned into organized violence. As the country edged towards civil war, some of these gangs began to dissipate. The remnants were absorbed into larger and more powerful organizations, including the Dead Rabbits and the WEOs. These were not just street toughs, they were structured gangs with territory, leadership, and political connections. By the 1870s, another demographic shift reshaped the neighborhood. Italian immigrants and Eastern European Jewish families began settling into the same crowded streets. The Irish no longer dominated the 5 Points the way they once had. Competition intensified. Control over rackets, territory, and illicit income became the defining struggle. Monk Eastman's Eastman gang, originally containing many Irish members before becoming predominantly Jewish, emerged as one of the most powerful criminal forces in the area. The streets of the Lower East Side became contested ground, not just between gangs, but between ethnic groups fighting for survival and influence. By the time the 19th century was closing, the 5 Points had already built its reputation. It was a training ground for violence, a proving ground for political corruption, a neighborhood where elections could be influenced with fists and ballots could be controlled through intimidation. It was in this environment, shaped by immigration, prejudice, poverty, and organized street violence, that a young Italian immigrant named Francesco Paolo Antonio Vaccarelli would eventually arrive and change the structure of crime in New York City. The 5 Points existed before Paul Kelly. but it was waiting for someone like him. By the 1870s, the Five Points was no longer the same Irish stronghold it had been in the decades before the Civil War. The streets were still crowded, the buildings were still crumbling, but the faces were changing. A new wave of immigrants began settling into Lower Manhattan. Italians arrived in growing numbers, many from southern regions like Sicily and Basilicata. Eastern European Jews followed, fleeing persecution and economic hardship. They moved into the same narrow tenements, the same overburdened blocks between Broadway and the Bowery, and into a neighborhood that already carried a long memory of violence. The older Irish gangs had begun to fade. Some had dissolved entirely. Others had been absorbed into larger organizations like the Dead Rabbits and the Weos. Their dominance weakened as demographics shifted. Territory that once belonged to Irish crews now became contested ground. Crime did not slow during this transition. It became more competitive. Gambling dens and brothels remained fixtures in the district. Illicit businesses generated steady income, and whoever controlled the streets controlled the revenue. Racketeering, robbery, and extortion were not random acts. They were part of a growing underground economy. Out of this environment rose new multi-ethnic criminal organizations. Among the most powerful was the Eastman Gang, led by a man known as Monk Eastman. Eastman's crew originally included many Irish members, reflecting the older five-point structure, but over time it became predominantly Jewish as the neighborhood shifted. Monk Eastman controlled large portions of the Lower East Side. His gang numbered in the thousands at its height. They fought for control of territory, rackets, and political influence. The Bowery became a dividing line in ongoing disputes. Every block had value, every saloon could be a headquarters, every brothel meant income. The competition was not limited to street crime. Politics ran through everything. Tammany Hall, the democratic political machine that dominated New York City, relied on gangs to influence elections. Gangs intimidated voters, stuffed ballot boxes, and ensured that certain candidates won primaries and general elections. Protection flowed in return. Arrests could disappear, charges could be reduced. Judges were sometimes willing to look the other way. As Italian immigrants grew in number, young men from those communities began forming their own street groups. They were often the sons of laborers and dock workers. They were familiar with poverty and exclusion. In that environment, gang membership offered income, protection, and identity. By the late 19th century, the Five Points was no longer defined by a single ethnic faction. It had become a battleground of Irish, Italian, and Jewish gangs competing for dominance. Alliances shifted. Violence flared and receded. The streets of Lower Manhattan were a living map of overlapping claims. This was the atmosphere into which Francesco Paolo Antonio Vaccarelli would step. He would not invent gang warfare in the Five Points. He would reorganize it. Francesco Paolo Antonio Vaccarelli was born on December 23, 1876, in the small village of Pietrapertosa in the southern Italian region of Basilicata. It was a mountainous place, isolated and poor like much of southern Italy in the late 19th century. Opportunity was scarce. For many families, emigration was not ambition, it was necessity. Vaccarelli's parents, Michele Vaccarelli and Angela LaCava, moved back and forth between Italy and the United States before finally settling in New York City. That pattern was common among immigrant families at the time. They chased work across the Atlantic, searching for stability. Eventually, New York became permanent. By the early 1890s, young Francesco was living in Manhattan. He worked first as a longshoreman, loading and unloading cargo along the waterfront. The docks were rough territory. They were controlled by men who understood force and loyalty. The work was physical and unpredictable. It introduced him to the rhythm of labor disputes and waterfront politics that would later shape his second career. After the docks, he found employment as a clerk in an Italian bank. The shift from manual labor to clerical work suggests something about him. He was not limited to one world. He moved between them. During the day, he worked in structured environments. At night, he drifted into the Bowery. The Bowery in the 1890s was filled with dive bars, gambling rooms, and street-level violence. Vaccarelli reportedly became involved in gang fights there. It was an arena where reputation mattered. Fights were currency. If a young man could hold his own, people noticed. He soon turned to boxing. Vaccarelli fought in the bantamweight division. His career was brief but successful. In 1897, the Bridgeport Herald described him as one of the fastest and cleanest little boxers in the business. Boxing in that era was not a polished sport with corporate sponsorships. It was tied to gambling, to saloons, to neighborhood pride. A good fighter could build a following. Around this time, he made a strategic decision. He changed his name. Francesco Paolo Antonio Vaccarelli became Paul Kelly. The choice was deliberate. Irish politicians dominated New York's democratic machine. An Irish-sounding name carried weight in certain circles. It suggested familiarity and political alignment. For an ambitious young man navigating Tammany Hall territory, the name was an investment. Kelly used his boxing earnings to open brothels and athletic clubs. The clubs were not simple gyms. They served as gathering points for young men from the immigrant neighborhoods of Lower Manhattan. Fighters trained there, so did aspiring street toughs. It was a recruiting ground disguised as a sporting venue. These early enterprises became the nucleus of what would soon be known as the 5 Points Gang. Kelly did not inherit a ready-made empire. He built a network first, one club at a time, one follower at a time. He combined the discipline of boxing with the economics of vice. He understood that power required structure. By the time the 19th century drew to a close, Paul Kelly was no longer simply a former dock worker or a promising boxer. He was assembling something larger, and the 5 Points was ready for it. By the 1890s, the 5 Points was primed for consolidation. The old Irish gangs that once dominated the neighborhood had weakened. Some had dissolved, others had splintered. The Dead Rabbits and the Weos still carried weight, but their era of unchecked dominance had passed. Paul Kelly saw opportunity in that fragmentation. Rather than build a gang from scratch in open defiance of the old order, he absorbed what remained of it. He recruited former members of the Dead Rabbits and the Weos into a new, more cohesive organization. Where earlier gangs had often operated as loose street factions, Kelly pushed towards structure. His background in boxing clubs gave him a framework. There was hierarchy, there was discipline, there were clear lines of loyalty. The 5 Points Gang that emerged under Kelly's leadership was not confined to one ethnicity. While it had continuity with the earlier Irish gangs of the neighborhood, it increasingly reflected the changing demographics of Lower Manhattan. Italian immigrants and Italian Americans became central to its leadership and membership. Irish members remained. Jewish, Polish, and other Eastern European immigrants were brought into the ranks over time. The gang mirrored the streets around it. Kelly recruited young, poor men from ethnically diverse immigrant neighborhoods in Lower Manhattan. For many of them, gang membership offered income and protection in a city that treated them as expendable labor. The athletic clubs Kelly operated served as a funnel. Fighters trained there, loyalists gathered there. Those who proved useful were brought deeper into the organization. The 5 Points Gang quickly developed a reputation for brutality. In battles with rival gangs, they fought to the death. Street warfare was not symbolic, it was physical and public. Gun battles broke out over territory. Knives were used in close quarters. Control of a block meant control of gambling rooms, brothels, and the steady income that flowed from them. As the gang grew, it began attracting young men who would later become some of the most powerful figures in American organized crime. Johnny Torrio joined the 5 Points Gang in its early years and rose to become Kelly's second-in-command. Torrio was disciplined and strategic. He absorbed Kelly's methods, particularly the emphasis on organization and business structure. A young Charles Lucky Luciano also joined the gang in his youth. So did Al Capone, who came from the James Street Gang before later leading the Chicago outfit. Others, including Meyer Lansky and Frankie Yale, would pass through the 5 Points orbit. At the time, they were street-level recruits. In hindsight, they were an apprenticeship class. By the end of the 1890s, the 5 Points Gang was no longer a loose alliance of neighborhood toughs. It was a structured criminal enterprise operating in Lower Manhattan, drawing strength from multiple immigrant communities and willing to engage in sustained warfare to defend its territory. Paul Kelly had taken the scattered remnants of older gangs and turned them into something more organized, more adaptable, and more ambitious. The 5 Points Gang had arrived. By the turn of the 20th century, Paul Kelly understood something that many street gang leaders did not. Control of territory was important. Control of politics was decisive. New York City was run by Tammany Hall, the democratic political machine that dominated elections through patronage, loyalty, and force. Tammany relied on neighborhood operators to secure votes in immigrant districts. In return, those operators received protection. Arrests could disappear, charges could soften. Influence flowed both ways. Kelly offered his services. He aligned himself with Tammany Hall figures, including Big Tim Sullivan and Tom Foley. The arrangement was practical. Kelly could deliver votes. Tammany could shield him from legal consequences. It was a partnership built on mutual benefit. The test of that alliance came on September 17, 1901, during the 2nd Assembly District primary election. The race pitted Tom Foley against incumbent Paddy Diver, a local saloon owner and longtime Tammany leader. Diver campaigned on keeping red light districts out of the 4th Ward. That position threatened the economic interests tied to prostitution and vice operations in the area. On primary day, Kelly deployed force. More than 1,500 members of his gang reportedly flooded the district. Supporters of Diver were assaulted. Polling booths were blocked. Voters were intimidated or turned away. Ballot boxes were manipulated. Fraud was widespread. One gang member later claimed that he personally cast 53 votes in a single day. The election was not close. Foley won. Kelly's role in securing that victory cemented his standing within Tammany Hall. He had demonstrated that his organization could deliver results when called upon. In neighborhoods where political legitimacy depended on turnout, intimidation proved effective. The rewards followed. Kelly gained control over vice districts in the 4th and 6th wards. That meant control over prostitution houses, gambling operations, and associated rackets in those areas. It amounted to a virtual criminal monopoly within the 5 Points. Political influence translated directly into economic power. The alliance also signaled a broader shift in how organized crime operated in New York. Gangs were no longer confined to street fights and neighborhood disputes. They had become instruments within the machinery of city politics. For Paul Kelly, the 1901 primary was more than an election. It was proof that power at the ballot box could be as valuable as power in the streets. And in New York at the start of the 20th century, the two were often the same. In 1903, at the height of his growing influence, Paul Kelly faced a direct challenge from the law. He was arrested on charges of assault and robbery. For a man who had cultivated political protection through Tammany Hall, the arrest was a reminder that alliances had limits. He was convicted and sentenced to 9 months in jail. When Kelly was released, he did not return quietly to the same structure. He reorganized. He formalized his network under a new name, the Paul Kelly Association. On paper, it was an athletic club. In practice, it functioned as a recruiting and command center for his expanding criminal enterprise. The headquarters were established at 24 Stanton Street. The location placed him squarely within the immigrant neighborhoods that supplied his manpower. Young men came through the doors looking for work, protection, or belonging. Some left as trained enforcers. Kelly understood presentation. He soon opened a more visible and ambitious establishment, the new Brighton Athletic Club at 57 Great Jones Street, between Lafayette and the Bowery. It was a 2-story cafe and dance hall. From the outside, it projected respectability. Inside, it operated as the nerve center of the 5 Points gang. The New Brighton served multiple purposes. It was a social venue that attracted prominent citizens and socialites. Kelly, always well-dressed and fluent in Italian, French, and Spanish, cultivated an image of refinement. He appreciated fine art and classical music. That persona impressed members of New York's elite, and created distance between him and the street-level brutality associated with gang leaders. At the same time, the club functioned as headquarters. Decisions were made there, alliances were negotiated, orders moved outward from its rooms into the streets of Lower Manhattan. During this period, the 5 Points gang expanded beyond its original neighborhood. Kelly's organization extended into other parts of Manhattan and even into parts of New Jersey. The structure he built was no longer confined to a few blocks around the 5 Points intersection. It had reach. The prison sentence had not weakened him. It forced him to refine his approach. Kelly was no longer operating solely as a gang leader commanding street fighters. He was building an organization with physical headquarters, political connections, and expanding territory. And the New Brighton stood at the center of it all. By the early 1900s, Lower Manhattan was divided by an invisible line. To the west of the Bowery stood Paul Kelly and the 5 Points gang. To the east stood Monk Eastman and his organization, which at its height numbered in the thousands. Both gangs operated under the shadow of Tammany Hall. Both delivered votes. Both expected protection. But the streets between them, particularly the contested strip along the Bowery, were too valuable to ignore. Control of that territory meant access to gambling rooms, prostitution houses, and the steady flow of extortion money. The violence escalated in 1901. That year, a member of the 5 Points gang shot Monk Eastman in the stomach. Eastman survived. Retaliation came quickly. One of his men killed a 5-pointer in response. The conflict moved beyond isolated attacks and into open warfare. By 1903, the feud had grown into large-scale street battles. In one confrontation, Kelly, Johnny Torrio, and approximately 50 5-pointers engaged in a gunfight with a similar number of Eastman's men. The clash lasted for hours. 3 men were killed. Many others were wounded. Police officers called to the scene were forced to retreat during the fighting before eventually regaining control. Public outrage followed. Civilians were being caught in the crossfire. Tammany Hall could not ignore the spectacle. Tom Foley, a Tammany Hall deputy, brought Kelly and Eastman together and made the political position clear. If they did not resolve their territorial dispute, neither would receive political protection. For a brief period, the violence subsided. Within 2 months, it resumed. Tammany Hall imposed a solution. The 2 leaders were ordered to settle the dispute in a boxing match. The winner's gang would take control of the contested territory. Hundreds of gang members gathered at an abandoned house in the Bronx on the appointed day. Kelly had once been a professional boxer. Eastman was physically larger and known for his ferocity. They fought for 2 hours. Kelly reportedly performed better in the early rounds. Eastman pressed forward with size and strength. By the end, both men were badly punished. Neither had been knocked out. The match was declared a draw. The decision settled nothing. After the fight, both leaders told their men that the war continued. The streets of the Lower East Side returned to the rhythm of gunfire and retaliation. The Bowery remained contested ground. The war between the 5 Points gang and the Eastman gang was not a simple rivalry. It was a struggle for economic control, political leverage, and dominance over New York's most volatile neighborhoods. And it was far from over. By 1904, the war between Paul Kelly and Monk Eastman had reached a turning point. The street battles had drawn too much attention. Civilians were being wounded. Newspapers were reporting gunfights that lasted for hours. Tammany Hall, which had once tolerated gang warfare as long as votes were delivered, began to reconsider its alliances. Monk Eastman made a critical mistake. He was arrested for robbing a man on the West Side, a target who had been under the protection of Pinkerton detectives hired by his family. The arrest placed Eastman in a vulnerable position. In previous years, political protection might have softened the consequences. This time, Tammany Hall declined to intervene. Eastman was convicted and sentenced in 1904 to 10 years in Sing Sing Prison, formerly known as Ossining Correctional Facility in Ossining, New York. The message was clear. Political support had shifted. With Eastman removed, the balance of power in Lower Manhattan changed overnight. The Eastman gang, deprived of its leader, began to fracture. Although the organization attempted to continue under new leadership, it never regained its former strength. Kelly moved carefully. Without a rival of equal size, the Five Points Gang gained effective control over organized crime activities on the Lower East Side. The contested territory along the Bowery no longer required daily warfare. Racketeering operations expanded, influence deepened. The remnants of the Eastman crew were further weakened in 1908, when Max "Kid Twist" Zverbach, who had once been a member of the Five Points Gang before defecting to Eastman's side, was murdered by hitmen from the Five Points Gang. The killing was allegedly carried out at the behest of Paul Kelly. It removed a volatile figure and reinforced Kelly's dominance. At the height of his power, Kelly presented himself differently from the gang leaders who had come before him. He operated out of the New Brighton Athletic Club, a two-story cafe and dance hall at 57 Great Jones Street. The establishment attracted socialites and prominent citizens. Kelly dressed sharply. He spoke Italian, French, and Spanish fluently. He appreciated fine art and classical music. This cultivated persona distinguished him from street-level enforcers. He projected control and refinement. According to later assessments, he is considered among the first in the United States to organize crime on a business model. Structure mattered to him. Loyalty was enforced. Political alliances were managed deliberately. In 1912, the New York Times ranked Paul Kelly as perhaps the most successful and the most influential gangster in New York history. It was a public acknowledgement of what the underworld already understood. The Five Points Gang had no effective rival in Lower Manhattan. Monk Eastman was in prison. The Bowery belonged to Kelly. For a brief period, he stood at the top of New York's criminal hierarchy, balancing street power with political leverage, and presenting himself as something more than a gang leader. He was an organizer, and he had built an empire. By late 1905, Paul Kelly stood at the height of his influence. Monk Eastman was in prison. The Five Points Gang controlled the Lower East Side. The New Brighton Athletic Club on Great Jones Street functioned as both social club and command center. From the outside, it projected polish and refinement. Inside, it was the headquarters of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in New York. The threat that nearly ended Kelly's career did not come from a rival gang. It came from within. In November 1905, two of Kelly's former lieutenants, Pat Razor Riley and James T. Biff Ellison, turned against him. Both men had once operated under Kelly's authority. By that time, they were aligned with the Gopher Gang. Whatever the motive, ambition, resentment, or shifting alliances, they chose to confront him directly. The attack took place inside the New Brighton. Kelly was drinking with bodyguards Bill Harrington and Roughhouse Hogan when Riley and Ellison opened fire. Shots were exchanged in close quarters. Harrington was killed while protecting Kelly. Kelly himself was shot 3 times but survived. Riley and Ellison escaped the scene. Kelly was taken to a private hospital before police could arrest him. A month later, he turned himself in. The charges were dropped, reportedly due to his political connections. Even wounded and publicly targeted, he retained enough influence to avoid prosecution. But the damage went beyond the gunshot wounds. The assassination attempt generated negative publicity. The spectacle of a gang leader nearly killed inside a fashionable club underscored the reality that the New Brighton was not merely a dance hall. Police Commissioner William McAdoo responded by closing the establishment, citing the need to protect its socialite regulars. The closure removed Kelly's most visible headquarters. The men who tried to kill him did not escape consequences. James T. Biff Ellison was arrested in 1911, convicted, and sent to prison. He later became mentally ill and was placed in an asylum, where he died. Pat Razor Riley was eventually found dead in his Chinatown basement hideout, reportedly from pneumonia. For Kelly, survival did not equal recovery. The attempt on his life marked the beginning of his decline in the New York underworld. Tammany Hall, already sensitive to public outrage over gang warfare, increased pressure on him to lower his profile. The Bowery was under scrutiny. Political alliances were recalibrating. Kelly had built his power through organization, discipline, and political ties. Now, internal betrayal and public attention weakened that foundation. He was still alive and he still had influence, but the era of unquestioned dominance was ending. Shooting at the New Brighton in 1905 did more than injure Paul Kelly. It changed the political climate around him. Public attention had intensified. Street warfare had become harder to justify. Tammany Hall, which had once benefited from his muscle at the polls, began pressing him to reduce the visibility of gang activity, particularly as reform movements pushed to clean up the Bowery. Kelly adapted. After the closure of the New Brighton Athletic Club by Police Commissioner William McAdoo, Kelly shifted his operations away from the spotlight of Great Jones Street. He moved much of his activity into Italian immigrant communities in Harlem and Brooklyn. These neighborhoods provided both familiarity and insulation. At the same time, he maintained ties to his original base and established himself in the Chelsea area. The transition marked a strategic pivot. Rather than dominate through open street control, Kelly began embedding himself in labor structures. Using his Americanized birth name, Paul Vaccarelli, he became vice president of the International Longshoremen's Association. The waterfront had been his workplace in the early 1890s. Now it became the foundation of a new kind of influence. Control over dock labor meant leverage over shipping, wages, and disputes. It offered a different revenue stream and a different form of authority. In 1919, Kelly was expelled from the ILA. Later that same year, he returned to the organization. His resilience in regaining positions suggests that his network remained intact. That year, a spontaneous port-wide strike erupted after management agreed to a wage increase of only 5 cents an hour. Longshoremen were dissatisfied. The docks were paralyzed. Kelly stepped into a leadership role during the strike. With the support of Mayor John F. Hylan, he was appointed to a commission tasked with resolving the dispute. Kelly ended the strike. The resolution did not secure concessions for the workers. The wage issue remained unresolved in their favor. Yet Kelly had demonstrated that his influence extended beyond street corners and dance halls. He could operate within formal labor structures and municipal negotiations. During the 1920s, he became involved in labor racketeering, providing muscle in labor disputes. The tactics were familiar: pressure, intimidation, enforcement. The setting had changed. Instead of Bowery saloons, it was union halls and waterfront docks. Tammany Hall had once relied on him to control elections. Now he operated in a quieter sphere, applying the same organizational principles to labor power. Paul Kelly did not disappear after the decline of the 5 Points Gang. He changed arenas. By the 1910s, the 5 Points Gang was no longer the dominant street force it had been under Paul Kelly's direct command. The structure he built had shifted. Political pressure had increased. Labor racketeering replaced open gang warfare. The old neighborhood model of control over a few square blocks in Lower Manhattan was giving way to something larger. What remained was not the gang itself, but its graduates. Among the most significant was Johnny Torrio, who had served as Kelly's second-in-command. Torrio absorbed Kelly's emphasis on structure and organization. He later relocated to Chicago, where he began establishing his own racketeering system. Torrio recruited Al Capone, who had come from the James Street gang and spent time within the 5 Points orbit. Under Torrio's guidance, Capone would rise to lead the Chicago outfit, expanding organized crime far beyond New York. Charles Lucky Luciano also emerged from the 5 Points ranks. As a young man, he had been shaped by the multi-ethnic environment Kelly fostered. Meyer Lansky and Frankie Yale were similarly connected to the 5 Points circle. Bugsy Siegel would later be associated with this generation as well. These men did not simply replicate old street gang models, they restructured them. A central influence in this transformation was Arnold Rothstein, described as an influential businessman and criminal strategist. Rothstein operated with a financial mindset. He treated crime as investment, expansion, and diversification. Figures like Torrio, Luciano, and Lansky learned from that approach. Then came Prohibition. In 1920, the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act established national prohibition. The sale and manufacture of alcohol became illegal. Demand did not disappear. It multiplied the opportunity for organized crime. Bootlegging became a massive source of revenue for emerging mafia families. The scale shifted from neighborhood rackets to national distribution networks. Transportation routes crossed state lines, alliances formed between cities, profit margins expanded beyond anything the old 5 Points vice districts had produced. Johnny Torrio was among the first to implement a structured racketeering model in Chicago. After Capone eventually replaced him there, Torrio played a role in helping form what became known as the National Crime Syndicate, coordinating with Luciano and Lansky. This was not a street gang in the old sense. It was a cooperative framework among organized crime leaders across the United States. By the 1920s, the 5 Points gang itself had faded as a dominant force. Mafia organizations increasingly took over the rackets once controlled by Kelly's crew. The structure had evolved. The geography had expanded. The profits had multiplied. What Paul Kelly built in Lower Manhattan became a training ground. His organization produced leaders who would shape American organized crime on a national scale. They carried forward the emphasis on hierarchy, business discipline, and political calculation that defined the 5 Points at its peak. The gang declined. Its influence did not. Paul Kelly died of natural causes on April 3, 1936, in New York City. He was 59 years old. He was buried at Calvary Cemetery in Queens. There was no public spectacle attached to his death. No dramatic shootout, no courtroom climax. The man who once commanded the streets of the 5 Points died quietly. What remained was his structural legacy. Before Kelly, New York's gangs were largely territorial street factions. After Kelly, organized crime operated with hierarchy, recruitment pipelines, political alliances, and expansion strategies. His organization became a proving ground for the generation that built national syndicates. The 5 Points neighborhood changed. The streets were renamed, the buildings were replaced. The intersection that gave the district its name no longer exists in its original form. But the system that grew out of it reshaped American organized crime for decades. Paul Kelly did not invent crime in New York, he organized it.